My parents disowned me and cut me out of their will because I'm not their biological child, but inheriting from a distant relative changed everything. Let us start from the beginning. My life changed dramatically when I was 14. Around this time, my mother decided to relax again, this time with a man whose previous marriage had produced a son. Jake, already 3 years older than me, was 17. Let's also admit that we didn't get along right away. The ink on their marriage certificate had hardly dried when the tension began to rise. At first, it was the tiny issues that arise when strangers are notified that they are suddenly family and brought together. Jake would leave dirty dishes in the sink, assuming they would clean themselves. Of course, I was the one who got a lecture from my mother or new stepfather about the kitchen mess. Alternatively, I would see my shampoo disappearing faster than usual, only to discover Jake with perfectly maintained hair that appeared to have resulted from using my favorite product. It was strange, but I felt upset by more than just Jake's antics. Tom, my stepfather, handled things in the same manner. I seemed to be the problem whenever things went wrong. He'd think I was responsible without even asking. Then there was my mom. She was too focused on making this new family dynamic work to see what was happening. She'd brush it off, cover for Jake, and pretend everything was fine. I could immediately detect the difference in expectations. Mom and Tom announced they were expecting a kid around a year into our difficult living situation. At that time, everything changed. Suddenly, everything revolved around the newborn. The house required renovations, and guess which room was chosen for the nursery? Exactly, mine. I was shoved into a cramped, claustrophobic guest room with barely enough room for my possessions. It felt like a demotion, a clear sign of my role in this new family structure. A few months later, Nathan, my new half-brother, was born and quickly became the center of attention. Jake felt the same shift and grew even more entitled. He dropped out of college and moved back home, bringing with him a whirlwind of late-night parties and questionable pals who came and went at all hours. Tom dismissed my protests about the noise and trash, while my mother simply looked sorrowful, as if to say, "What can we do?" It was infuriating. I started spending more time at friends' places, anywhere I could find routine. My escape ended up being school. I stayed as long as I could, joining every organization and taking extra classes. It was more than just adolescent defiance. It was about survival. Home became a place where I always felt as if I was walking on eggshells, waiting for the next explosion. It was suffocating. One evening stands vividly in my mind. I got home later than usual to find the house utterly still. A note on the refrigerator indicated that they had gone out to dinner, without me. I hadn't even been invited to this family supper. That note struck harder than I expected. I felt invisible, as if I did not truly belong. And it stung. Not shortly after my 18th birthday, everything almost broke. I felt Tom disliked me having any excuse to leave the house, despite the fact that I worked part-time. He repeatedly told me that it would jeopardize my academic progress. Then one evening, I returned home to discover my room utterly trashed. Jake hosted a party while my mom and Tom were gone, and my room suffered as a result. A broken lamp, alcohol stains on my project documentation. It was an outright breach of my privacy. I challenged them at breakfast the next morning. Tom responded coldly and contemptuously, "You should have been more responsible with your belongings." My mother simply sighed and whispered something about families coming together and letting go. I had finished letting things pass. Everything I did during those years seemed to be scrutinized, but not in a way that suggested concern for my well-being. Rather, it appeared like they were waiting for me to make a mistake so they could blame me. Jake, who had turned into a professional couch potato, appeared to get away with it all. Although Nathan, my tiny half-brother, was still a child, the amount of coddling he received revealed who the favorite was. I remember one time when I was working on a large science project that I found really interesting. Even at home, working on it was nearly impossible. I desired silence, so I set up a workstation in the corner of the living room. It felt like I was trying to build something delicate in the heart of Times Square. I eventually had enough. Jake would play loud music, Nathan would run about shouting, and Tom would complain about how my project was taking up too much space or making a mess. After packing, I went to see a buddy, whose parents allowed me to work in their tranquil dining room. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was able to concentrate. That was when I realized how odd my home life had become. My friend said, "You're always welcome here." The invitation was easy, yet it meant everything to me. For me, home was just a place I couldn't wait to leave. Home is supposed to be a secure refuge, yet every hour away from it helped me breathe a little easier. I started working extra shifts at my job. Of course, Tom didn't like it. He frequently mentioned my job as a distraction from school, but I knew why he disliked it. I wasn't around as much for him to critique. As I accumulated more money, the thought of moving out began to form in my head, but I realized it would not be easy. My mother and Tom were unable of dealing with the situation. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the only option to regain control of my life. I was a ball of worry the day I decided to inform them I was leaving. I discovered a basic yet fairly priced apartment near my campus. From my part-time employment, I had saved enough to cover the first 3 months' rent. It wasn't a lot, but it was mine. The prospect of having my own life and space kept me focused. One evening, after dinner, I seated Tom and Mom at the kitchen table. With my heart pumping, I attempted to keep my voice calm. I looked them in the eyes and said, "I'm moving out." The room became silent, and I could feel the tension mounting. You could have heard a pin drop. Tom was the first to reply. He smiled, shook his head and said, as if I had told him the most stupid thing imaginable, "You think you're ready to live on your own, just because of your age?" His voice was filled with amazement and a trace of mockery. At first, my mother said nothing. She simply sat there, staring down at the table, her expression unreadable. "I am ready," I said, attempting to sound more confident than I felt. The disagreement began when I stated that I needed my own room and had enough savings to cover it. Tom went on a rampage, accusing me. I was selfish, unappreciative, and tried to avoid my responsibilities at home. "He looks up to you, you know?" he continued, attempting to guilt me into leaving Nathan behind. As if that were enough to keep me in a hazardous atmosphere. My mother's response was calmer, but no less devastating. She did not dispute with me, like Tom did, nor did she attempt to stop me. She only continued to complain, saying things like, "Families stick together, and you'll regret it if you leave." But I knew better. This was not about family. It was about control. I stayed put not because I just desired my own space, but because I needed it for my emotional and psychological well-being. I felt like an outsider in my supposed home. I was tired of being held accountable for things beyond my control and of attempting to fit into a family that had made it apparent that I was not actually a member of it. I spent the following few days preparing. Every item I packed into a box felt like a step closer to independence, even though it wasn't easy. My mother entered my room on the morning I was supposed to leave. I readied myself for another battle, but it never happened. Instead, she helped me pack discreetly. Our conversation was brief. She asked whether I needed extra boxes or offered to donate old utensils. We both appeared to be avoiding the actual concerns, making light talk to avoid admitting that this was the end of something. Later that day, when I locked the door to my new flat, I experienced an uncommon range of feelings, including relief, grief, excitement, and worry. I was now living completely on my own. It felt simultaneously liberated and terrible. The first few nights were the most challenging. The flat seemed overwhelmingly empty and quiet. I found myself longing even the disagreeable sounds of home, like Jake's loud music, Nathan running around, and Tom's incessant nagging. However, as the days passed into weeks, I grew to cherish the silence. For the first time in years, I could actually breathe. I no longer had to tiptoe around the house, worrying about Tom's mood swings or whether Jake had hosted another party. I could come and go as I liked, eat when I wanted and sleep uninterrupted. It seemed like I was finally discovering who I was beyond the insanity of my family. A new type of freedom. Life rapidly found its groove. I balanced work, education, and maintaining my modest apartment. It was not flashy, but it was mine. My connection with my mother and Tom improved slightly after I moved out of their house. I kept my distance but saw them sometimes, which made things easier. Then, unexpectedly, I received a call from my mother. Her speech was muted and more light than normal. "Tom's been thinking about his will," she added, simply as if discussing the weather. "He wants to make sure everything is in order." I reacted hesitantly, not sure where this was going. After a pause, she said, "He has decided to include Jake and Nathan but not you. Because they are his biological children, he believes it is more rational." There it was. It stings. Although I hadn't expected much from Tom, seeing it stated so bluntly hurt me harder than I anticipated. It wasn't about the money, but about the message. The reminder that, despite all these years, I was still not regarded as a member of the family. I forced myself to answer neutrally. "I understand." Mom, maybe sensing the hurt, hastily attempted to ease the impact. "You understand, this is just legal things. It doesn't impact our feelings for you, right?" Even if I didn't believe her, I allowed the conversation to divert to other issues. But the harm was already done. That night I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, with that familiar sense of not belonging gnawing at me. Part of me wanted to confront Tom, demand an explanation, or simply tell him how deeply it hurt. However, another part of me questioned the point. For years, that family had not felt like a part of me, so why should it matter now? I ultimately decided to back off. I reduced my visits, stayed busy with school and work, and spent more time cultivating relationships with people who actually appreciated me. Friends, instructors, and co-workers who loved me for who I was, not for what I could contribute or because we had once shared a home. These were the individuals that mattered. The anguish from Tom's will and years of feeling like an outsider began to recede. It wasn't an overnight metamorphosis, but the hatred subsided, though it would occasionally boil up, especially at family events, when I saw Jake and Nathan relishing in the spotlight. I began to realize that some things were beyond my control. I started establishing my own family and sense of belonging. A few months later, Tom recovered from his health scare and their lives resumed to normal. Then came the actual test. I was invited to a family dinner to celebrate Tom's recovery. I went out of responsibility, rather than choice. The evening was just as awkward as I expected. Tom talked about his recuperation. Everyone gushed about Nathan's newest academic accomplishments, and Jake boasted about a new job he had suddenly landed. I sat there relatively silent, and it was painfully obvious that I was the odd one out. However, this time it stung less. I had come to terms with my status in the family. I was the outsider, yet there were individuals in my life that cared for me for myself, not because of family obligations or shared DNA. I made an excuse about an early start and went after dinner. As I drove home, I felt a weight lifted from my shoulders. I'm good, I told myself. Really good. I dealt with the emotional impact, faced the truth of my situation, and emerged stronger and more confident in myself than ever before. For the first time in years, I felt peaceful. But life had another surprise in store. Just when I thought I had finally achieved some calm and routine, everything turned upside down again. One afternoon, I got a call from a lawyer I'd never heard of. His tone was courteous and professional, but his voice had an almost apologetic aspect. "Am I speaking with Jessica Evans?" he inquired. "Yes, that's me," I explained, bewildered. "I'm calling about Margaret Evans, your great-aunt's estate," he explained, his tone slow and measured. "She passed away recently and named you as the sole beneficiary." For a little period I fell silent. I couldn't recall Aunt Margaret. She was one of those distant relatives you'd hear about but never actually knew. She didn't have any children, and I faintly remembered my father mentioning her once or twice as someone who had helped raise him. I hadn't seen her in years, possibly since I was a tiny child. And now I'm being informed she's left everything to me. "I'm sorry for your loss," the lawyer said, breaking the stillness. "She was a remarkable woman." Still absorbing his remarks, I blurted out a thank you. Then, half expecting it to be something simple, perhaps an old house or a few family heirlooms, I inquired, "Exactly what did she leave behind?" "Your great-aunt was quite well off," he said. "Over the years, she made some excellent investments. The estate contains various properties, a significant stock portfolio, and a trust fund worth approximately $3 million. My heart halted for a moment. I sat there gripping my phone thinking, why me? We weren't very close. When I was younger, I paid her a few trips, but our relationship was never genuinely strong. My mind could not fully grasp it. The attorney then stated, "She left a letter for you. I will forward it together with the other documents." He noted that she went into greater detail regarding her decision. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, trying to make sense of everything. Why did Aunt Margaret chose me to inherit everything? I scarcely know her. Was this some kind of mistake? The next few days were spent meeting with the attorney, signing paperwork, and discovering exactly what I had inherited. There were houses, stocks, and personal stuff in addition to the money. Aunt Margaret's letter, however, impacted me deeply. In it, she stated that she had always appreciated my independence and saw in me a reflection of herself at my age. She described me as determined, self-sufficient, and capable of creating a life on my own, qualities she thought she lacked when she was younger. She wanted to offer me the opportunity to spend her riches for something meaningful. It was overwhelming. Here was this relative I barely knew, who saw something in me that my own family hadn't noticed. She appreciated and chose me. My initial move was to purchase a tiny home. Though it wasn't lavish, it was mine and represented a new chapter in my life. Thinking about long-term financial security, I also bought a rental property and invested the leftover monies. I spoke with a financial expert to ensure that I made sound judgments. It seemed weird. In the course of a week, my life had entirely changed. I no longer had to scrape by or wonder how I would make ends meet. For the first time, I felt truly secure and free. However, freedom brought a new set of challenges. At first, I didn't notify anyone about the bequest, even my relatives. Given our tumultuous past, I knew the news would not be well received. I owe them nothing. But secrets have a way of getting out, and mine was no exception. It began with a cousin I hadn't seen in years, who heard about the inheritance through legal means. My mother found out before I did, and the rest of the family soon followed suit. The phone calls started almost immediately. First, my mother called in an unusually cheerful and inquisitive tone. She complimented me, then casually stated how difficult things had been financially for her and Tom. I sensed where the talk was going, and sure enough, the floodgates erupted. Tom called first, then Jake, and then some distant cousins I hadn't heard from in years. Each intimated, in their own way, that they needed a piece of my inheritance. Times are tough, they would say. My mother even commented, "You know how bad Tom's health has been," as if this explained their newfound interest in me. They all seemed to have forgotten about me, but only as a possible ATM. I was overwhelmed with requests for money, loans and gifts. It felt like vultures were circling, waiting for their time to swoop down. I felt overwhelmed. For a brief period, I considered quitting up, questioning whether holding on to the bequest was selfish. But then I remembered all the years I'd spent feeling like an outsider in my own family, being blamed, discarded and ignored. I had worked hard to earn whatever I had before this windfall. I had gotten it through college on my own without their help, and now that I had some stability, they wanted to take it away. When I was struggling, none of them volunteered to help. When my mother eventually inquired why I hadn't told her about the bequest sooner, I found the strength to reject the guilt and manipulation. I softly but firmly explained to her that our separation was both emotional and physical. I had been kept away, ignored, and alienated for years, as if I belonged nowhere in the family. This inheritance allowed me to live on my own, without relying on anybody else. It is my life, I assured her, and I must live it in my own manner. I apologize if this offends you, but right now I need to act in my best interests. The outcome of that conversation was worse than I could have predicted. Mom accused me of being arrogant and inconsiderate. Tom interjected, chastising me about how families should treat one another. Nonetheless, I stood my ground. Over time the calls got less frequent, and the demands for money ceased when they understood I would not give in. It was challenging, but extremely necessary. I had realized a sad reality about family. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who bring you down. Knowing that I had protected myself brought me calm. Finally, I decided not to let them dictate my life. This inheritance was about taking control of my own destiny and, more importantly, gaining the ability to live my life on my own terms. My communication with them became strained, but I'd become accustomed to it. Their approval was no longer required, and I was not bound to offer them anything. I had friends, mentors, and people who actually cared about me, not because of familial obligations, but because of who I was. The big surprise came from an unexpected source. My younger half-brother, Nathan. I unexpectedly received a clumsy handwritten note from him. "I'm sorry for asking for money. I miss you," he wrote in his untidy handwriting. Though little, this step meant a lot to me. Nathan, barely 14, was reaching out in his own way. After that, we started texting. Little conversations about his school and interests, nothing too serious, but it was something. It was the start of a modest bridge between us, even though I wasn't optimistic about reconciling with the rest of the family. I was creating a life for myself, free of need on anyone else. For the first time in years I felt completely free. However, the impression of tranquility was fleeting. Just as I thought things had settled down, my mother contacted me again a few weeks after Nathan's letter. This time, she wished to talk things over. I could tell this wasn't going to be a chat about reconnecting or finding common ground, so I agreed to see her in public in the hopes of keeping things nice. We met at a nearby cafe and the vibe was unsettling from the start. She rarely inquired about my life or how I was doing. Instead, she got right into how difficult things had been financially since Tom's health crisis and how Nathan's private school fees were stacking up. I sat there, listening, feeling like an outsider in her list of troubles. It quickly became evident why she had requested to meet. She also added that they were thinking of upgrading the house and that she really needed a vacation to relieve her stress. It was clear she was not there to heal our relationship. She was there for a single reason. Finally, I could not stand it any longer. I cut through the tension, saying, "Mom, just get to the point." She looked me in the eye and said, without hesitation, "I expect you to write me a check for $1 million. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me?" I asked incredulously. She did not waver. "It is only fair. Technically, since it came from your father's side of the family, all of that money should have been mine. I was shocked. Her entitlement and audacity were astonishing. She sat there, casually demanding $1 million as if it was her birthright. I said bluntly, trying to keep my voice steady, "I'm not giving you $1 million." Her tone moved from entitled to plain angry, and her expression became severe. "You have always been unappreciative of everything we've done for you," she told us. Her remarks painted me as a criminal for not turning her the money she claimed she was owed. Without turning back, I paid the money and left the cafe. It still surprises me that my own mother attempted to guilt me into giving her money to which she had no right. What followed was even worse. A few days later, my mother started circulating rumors. She informed everybody who would listen that I had stolen the inheritance, saying it was rightfully hers, and accused me of hoarding it out of greed. Suddenly, relatives I hadn't heard from in years began calling, either to support her or to pressure me into sharing the money. The hypocrisy was staggering, especially given that Tom had omitted me from his own will because I wasn't family. Even Tom got involved, writing me a long guilt-ridden text about how I needed to consider the family and make more inclusive decisions. I reacted in a single sentence. "You didn't include me in your will because I'm not family, remember?" That shut him off for a while. But the drama did not end there. Things got heated when I received an official-looking letter in the mail. To my amazement, my mother was suing me. Yes, you read that correctly. She was suing me for a share of the inheritance, claiming that as my father's widow, she was entitled to a large amount of the money. I was stunned. Was my own mother dragging me to court? I could not believe it. At first I was afraid, expecting a protracted and costly court battle. I called my attorney, who laughed after reading the letter. "This is a joke," he remarked, flinging the letter away. "The will is airtight." He next investigated the so-called attorney who had sent the letter. The phone number was disconnected, and the address on the letterhead was for a decrepit building under construction. It became evident that my mother and Tom had engaged a dodgy, most certainly fraudulent lawyer in a last-ditch attempt to terrify me into paying them money. While I was happy that the lawsuit was unfounded, I was also terribly disappointed. Their willingness to go to such lengths for my inheritance was surprising. They had tried guilt-tripping and manipulating me, and now they were making direct legal threats. I was done attempting to salvage any sort of relationship with them. I understood I needed some distance. After the legal jitters passed, the emotional toll hit me hard. I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and the constant drama was affecting my mental health. That was when I realized I needed a vacation from everything. We decided to take a road trip after talking with some of our friends. Nothing extravagant, just a trip to a couple spots we'd always wanted to go but never got around to. It was just what I needed. Time to clear my mind, escape the chaos, and, most importantly, consider what I wanted for my future. As we began the road, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a little period. A year ago, I was barely making it in a house that never felt like home. I now had financial security, my own home, and the freedom to make my own judgments without interference from others. It felt liberating, yet also bittersweet. Growing up, I looked to my mother and stepfather for guidance and encouragement. To me, family meant having someone who would always have your back, no matter what. But through it all, I learned a terrible lesson. Just because someone is family by blood does not guarantee they are there for you in the ways that matter. Throughout the trip, I reflected a lot and realized that I didn't need their money, validation, or acceptance. I had everything I needed, and the relationships I actually valued were those I had formed with people who loved me for who I was, not what I could offer them. In little ways, my friends, colleagues, and even Nathan expressed more genuine care for me than my mother or Tom ever did. Following the trip, I decided to write letters to each family member who had attempted to influence me. I did it for me and not for others. It was my way of achieving closure, expressing what I couldn't say in the heat of the moment. In those letters, I detailed how their actions had harmed me and how, despite my desire to be a member of the family, I was constantly pushed aside. I wished them well and hoped they would move on, just as I had. The only reaction I received came from Nathan. His letter was modest but sincere. "I appreciate you delivering the letter. I miss you. Let us get together sometime." It wasn't much, but it was the beginning. Nathan and I might one day develop something real, free of obligation or manipulation. As for the rest of the family, I had finally accepted that we were better off at a distance. The inheritance had served as a wake-up call. Not just a financial boon, but also a revelation about my true family. It wasn't the folks who raised me. It was those who supported me when I had nothing to offer but myself. Looking back, I don't have any regrets. I stayed firm, safeguarded my future and found peace by letting go of the poisonous connections that had been holding me back. Life has a peculiar way of teaching us what is actually essential, and I'm glad for that, no matter how harsh the lessons were. Sitting in my own home, surrounded by people who feel more like family than my actual relatives ever did, I know I'm precisely where I should be. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.